This is the famous story of the man who built a giant ark in preparation for a massive flood that would cover the entire earth. The ship had to be big enough to support the man, his family, and samples of all living things. The flood was being sent down to wipe away the wickedness of humanity. Being warned in advance, the man went about building the giant ark. His fellow villagers thought he was crazy for building such a large ship. It wouldn't even fit in the river, they said. Why would he build such a thing? They made fun of him and told him he was crazy. But the man kept on building, knowing he would be ready for the great flood. Then one day the rains came, slowly at first, and then slowly turned to heavy. The skies opened and the rains poured. All day and all night the water fell. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months. The ground turned to mud, then puddles, then pools. The rivers began to swell, then overflow. The man knew this was the flood he'd been warned about. He loaded up the boat. The rivers and lakes overflowed. The man and his family were launched out to sea. The rest of the villagers, being unprepared, were swept away by the flowing water. The village became completely submerged and eventually washed away. The giant ark sailed the seas for months until the rains and the floods finally came to an end. The man sent out birds to see if the waters had receded. The ship finally came to rest on a mountaintop. I'm talking, of course, about the story we're all familiar with, from thousands of years ago, the ever-popular flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's not the name I remember for this story. Hello, I'm Tom Hackett, and this is my podcast about the ancient art of storytelling. Here we discuss the origins and evolution of stories through ancient mythology, legends, and oral traditions. Because every story has a story. A 1,000 years before the Old Testament was written, before Buddhism was founded, and Homer recorded the Iliad and the Odyssey, an unknown author recorded the first enduring story in the history of humankind. Written on clay tablets from the ancient civilization of Sumeria over 4,000 years ago. Sumer is the earliest known civilization of Mesopotamia, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first known epic poem in history to ever be recorded. Etched into clay, this tablet is what separates historians from archaeologists. Both research the human past, but historians study documented evidence or recorded events. Archaeologists study prehistory from before language developed in an area. They study physical evidence, such as artifacts. The oldest written records archaeologists have discovered are actually in Egypt. The pyramid texts date back to 5,000 years ago. The date when written records were created is the accepted date in which formal history begins in that part of the world. Everything else is considered prehistory or ancient history. Writing was invented independently in the Near East, China, and Mesoamerica. The cuneiform script, created in Mesopotamia, or present-day Iraq, started around 3200 BC. Writing was originally invented as a form of counting and recording goods written on clay tablets. It soon became a way of creating narrative works of art. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends ancient history and signals the beginning of recorded history. It's also the first superhero epic ever recorded. Interestingly, the epic poem was lost to historians and archaeologists until 170 years ago. The archaeologists were searching for evidence of the first biblical stories. What they found were oral histories that dated back further than they expected. The Gilgamesh Dream Tablet was discovered in the ruins of the oldest library in the world. It belonged to an ancient Assyrian king from Nineveh, now northern Iraq. For 2,500 years, the tablets lay buried under mounds of sand. An epic poem found in broken pieces. An archaeologist discovered the tablets in 1853. The findings were largely left alone for 2 decades until a scholar began to decipher the ancient text. Before Zeus, Jesus, and Buddha, there was Gilgamesh. What happened to this story? How was it almost erased from history? Why are there incredibly similar stories throughout different eras that fail to mention old Gilgamesh? Yet we can see the ideas represented in other great literature and religious texts. Noah's Ark and the Great Flood is just one example from this masterpiece. The Iliad and The Odyssey use the same story structure and elements. There are similarities to Hercules, as well as Jason and the Argonauts. We can draw parallels to Siddhartha and his explorations to find the meaning of life. Beowulf, King Arthur, even the iconic search for the Fountain of Youth is explored in the poem. So why did it disappear from history? Is it possible that a neighboring civilization tried to destroy the tablets? Did the Akkadians want to destroy the story when they destroyed Sumeria? Did the Greeks not want to credit the original creators? Did Christianity struggle with the love story? Did religious fanatics erase all evidence of the tale? Maybe the Babylonians broke the tablets in an effort to wipe out the legend. Or did a competing religion alter the facts to serve their own needs? Was it a case of syncretism? What's amazing is that there's a word for this, that it happens so often that a word was needed to define it. Syncretism is the merging or assimilation of original traditions into new mythologies or religions. We see evidence of newer religions assimilating earlier tales all the time. Adapt a myth and make it your own. Familiarity is always easier to follow. Convince followers that their story is close to the actual events, but not quite. Creating unfamiliar stories is a lot more work. Tell someone they almost have the right idea, but the actual tale happened this way. Almost sounds like mythological or religious gaslighting. The familiar becomes new. The old becomes lost. Destroy the evidence. We've seen this before. In the pagan myths influenced throughout Christianity, Christmas in particular. Winter solstice was celebrated by the pagans on December 25th. It was the shortest, darkest day of the year in the Julian calendar. Pagans would give gifts to the sun god so he would return. The temple of Saturn was used to celebrate Saturnalia, which included gift-giving, singing, lighting candles, decorating houses, and merrymaking. The spring equinox was also a time of celebration. Easter was the goddess of spring and fertility. Eggs represented birth in pagan traditions. They were decorated and used in games. Both winter solstice and spring solstice line up quite well with Christmas and Easter. Another example of syncretism is the number 13. It's considered bad luck. Any idea why? The Mayans believed 13 was a holy number. In fact, 13 is an incredibly common number in nature. The shell of a turtle has 13 rectangles. A rattlesnake has 13 rattles. There are 13 major joints in the human body, with the ankles, knees, hips, wrists, elbows, shoulders, and neck. The Mayans believed in 13 levels of heaven and 13 original gods. They counted 13 constellations. Their lunar cycle is measured in roughly 29 days, creating 12 regular months and a partial period referred to as the lunar 13th month. But 13 is in disagreement with our current Gregorian calendar, as introduced by Pope Gregory XIII. The Last Supper had 13 guests. The last guest to arrive, number 13, was Judas, who betrays Jesus. In ancient Norse lore, evil and turmoil are introduced to the world by the appearance of the mischievous god Loki at a dinner party in Valhalla. Loki was the 13th guest. He upset the balance of the 12 gods already in attendance. On October 13th, a Friday in 1307, the French king Philip IV ordered the terrible defeat of the Knights Templar. Their leader was burned alive at the stake on Friday the 13th. To this day, in North America, we do not have 13th floors listed on our elevators. I'm sure Loki is enjoying that somewhere. Ethnocide is the destruction of culture. Evidence of book burnings have taken place throughout history. These have been attempts to wipe out whole academic histories and beliefs. Were these tablets burnt or destroyed to erase the stories? Those who win the war get to write the rules, or smash the tablets in this case, and recreate their own rules. Evidence of the destruction of written knowledge exists with the ancient Mayan codices, the folding books that were created by the Mayans. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landa was responsible for bringing the Roman Catholic faith after the Spanish conquisition of the Yucatan. In 1562, in an effort to end the Mayan practices of idolatry, the bishop burnt the Mayan codices. Landa described burning 27 books and over 5,000 Mayan cult images. It's truly heartbreaking to think about how much history was destroyed. Not to get too controversial. Okay, we aren't afraid of a little controversy here. Within our lifetime, we've witnessed the church erasing stories from societies, most recently with the First Nations through the residential schools. Those schools existed up until 20 years ago. They tried to erase language, beliefs, and the ancient tales passed down through generations from their elders. The motto of the church was "Kill the Indian, save the child." Destroying people's culture is an age-old practice that is a sad reminder of how precious identity really is. Think of all the oral traditions, wisdom, and history of ancient peoples that has been erased. Destroyed works are irreplaceable. Their burnings are a severe loss to all of our cultural heritage. Other well-known examples include the burning of books under China's Qin dynasty, the obliteration of the Library of Baghdad, the destruction of the Aztec codices, and the burning of Jaffna Public Library in Sri Lanka 40 years ago. In other cases, such as the Nazi book burnings, copies of the destroyed books survived, but the instance of book burning becomes emblematic of a harsh or oppressive regime seeking to censor or silence some aspect of prevailing culture. The 3.5 remaining Mayan codices that escaped destruction can be found in the most obvious locations you would expect. No, sadly, not in Mexico or Central America. Not even in South America. One resides in Dresden, Germany. One is in Spain, of course, and the third is in Paris. Fragments of a fourth codex were discovered, and luckily, this version stayed in Mexico City. Do the codices belong in museums around the world? It's certainly good to have other cultures be able to see and study the history, but no one really knows how the Dresden Codex ended up in Germany. Luckily, it still exists and gives us insight into an ancient people and their culture, which is what the Epic of Gilgamesh has shown us. Though the first tablets were inscribed 4,000 years ago, the thought is that the story was likely told through ballads for 1,000 years previous to that. While the first surviving pyramid was being built and Stonehenge was being created, the story of Gilgamesh, King of Uruk, was being honed and crafted by minstrels and balladeers, passed down through generations as oral traditions, until eventually being written down and immortalized forever. Almost. If the ancient ruins of the library hadn't have been excavated, we may never have known about the tale. Once the first pieces turned up, thousands more tablets were found. To this day, we've only recovered bits and pieces of the whole story. More fragments keep turning up, but only about 80% of the epic has been found. Scholars believe that this epic poem may have been used to teach language. Students would have inscribed the story into clay as they practiced their writing. The story was so well known that it was common for people to reference the king when they achieved something great. They would say, "I dug out the well of Gilgamesh," or "I chopped the wood of Gilgamesh." Then, around 100 BC, the story seems to completely disappear from history, until it was rediscovered almost 2,000 years later. Were the tablets destroyed? The ideas retold to fit different narratives? Or did the story simply lose its luster? Were the ideas taken and told in new and exciting ways, such as the Iliad and Hercules? Were the existing tablets no longer needed and simply returned to the earth to decompose like all things? Maybe people were tired of writing on tablets and wanted fresh stories written on papyrus in new languages. I find it so interesting that the story disappeared for thousands of years. It would have been lost forever without discovering the tablets. How did the story disappear? Did the ancient Greeks know of the tale? Did Aristotle break down the Epic of Gilgamesh when he introduced his concepts of storytelling? A story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It must have pity, fear, and catharsis, all elements found in Gilgamesh. So what makes an epic poem? Epics are generally mythologized histories. They're a conglomeration of pre-existing stories and characters, often of oral origin, loosely based on historical characters or events, set in a mythologized distant time, usually in the past. The epic describes the hero's journey of self-discovery and emotional, psychological, and spiritual maturation. The protagonist confronts the reality of death and realizes heroism is a spiritual or psychological quality, not just a physical one. And the hero learns that love is more valuable than material wealth or even life itself. Some examples are the Iliad and the Odyssey, Beowulf, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Dante's Inferno, The Lord of the Rings, most superheroes, Superman, Batman, the Avengers, James Bond, Star Wars, and Star Trek. Why do we not hear stories about the Greeks using it for their studies? When the poem was originally discovered, it was considered a Greek epic, even though it predates the Greek culture by 1,000 years. Why did the stories make their way into the Bible in slightly altered ways? Give credit where credit is due, people. The flood story was an oral tradition about always being prepared. Mother Nature will surprise us, and we should never take climate change for granted. Droughts and floods can happen at any time. Humans have known this information for thousands of years. Flood myths are common in cultures all around the world. They extend back into the Bronze Age. Africa, Egypt, Mesoamerica all depict stories about a flood, global in scale, sent by a god to destroy civilization as an act of divine retribution. Most North American First Nations have flood stories. The Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, Cree, Inuit all have flood myths. One of my archaeology professors told me this story that he heard from an elder of a Northern First Nations community. The elder said that an indigenous man went about carving a massive canoe because the spirits told him to. The canoe was gigantic. The villagers laughed and said he made it too big. When it was done, the man carried the canoe all the way to the top of a mountain. The villagers laughed even more and ridiculed him. "There's no water up there. Why would you put a canoe on top of a mountain?" The man drove a wooden anchor into the top of the peak. Then he took 50 feet of birch rope and attached it to the canoe. The villagers thought he lost his mind. Then one day there was a sudden storm. The sky opened and the rains fell. There was an earthquake. It all happened so quickly that barely anyone had time to react. The man grabbed his family and his supplies. They had a seed for every living thing. They ran up the mountain and jumped into the canoe. The rain poured down. It didn't stop. The rivers and lakes swelled and overflowed. The village was flooded. The rising water creeped up the mountain until the canoe began to float from the mountain peak. The anchor kept the canoe from sailing away. The canoe rose 50 feet until the birch rope almost broke apart. For days the family stayed floating in the canoe while the flood wiped away their village and all the people that lived there. The rain finally stopped, and the water began to recede. The canoe came back to rest on top of the mountain. The man and his family got out of the canoe and walked down to their home. The village was gone, completely washed away. There were no more villagers left. They had all drowned in the flood. The story is an oral history that goes back before the Spanish arrived 500 years ago. This flood story could have traveled with the elders' ancestors for 15,000 years when they crossed Beringia. We don't know when the first flood story was actually told. It could go back tens of thousands of years, maybe from when people first left Africa. Some groups went north through Europe, and some went to the Middle East, then to China and Russia, eventually crossing Beringia and settling in the Americas. Once they left Africa, the two groups split apart and never saw each other again. They could have all shared the flood story that passed down from generation to generation. The two groups remained apart for tens of thousands of years, until the Vikings eventually left Scandinavia, sailing across the Atlantic 1,000 years ago. The Vikings settled on the shores of the Americas, coming into contact with the indigenous peoples, completing the circle for the journey of our ancestors out of Africa. He who saw the deep. What a beautiful opening line to start the poem. This begins our introduction to Gilgamesh, King of Uruk. He's something between a god and a human, the son of a king and a goddess. His mother was the goddess Ninsun. Being a demigod is a trait written in many other religious texts. Hercules is the son of Zeus and a human mother. Jesus is the son of God and a human mother. The Epic of Gilgamesh is thought to have been the influence for many tales, including Hercules, Homer's epic ancient Greek poems, the Iliad and The Odyssey, Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, and many others. According to the Sumerian kings list, Gilgamesh is an actual ruler whose father was a king before him. He's thought to have been a real person ruling the city of Uruk sometime between 2800 BC and 2500 BC. His powers were unequaled on Earth. The reign of Gilgamesh lasted for 126 years. That's a long life for a human, but not so long for a demigod. 5 Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh have been partially recovered. The ancient Babylonian version titled the poem, Surpassing All Other Kings. An Akkadian version consists of 12 tablets that are still incomplete. In the tale, the survivor of the Great Flood tells Gilgamesh, I became immortal after a one-off event that will never be repeated. The poet describes immortality as an incredibly lonely existence and might be considered hell on earth. When the rain ceased and things had gone quiet, he opened a hatch and looked out, and he saw only water. I knelt me down and sat there weeping, and over the sides of my cheeks the tears did flow. This is the realization that he's now the last surviving person on earth. Imagine the sense of loneliness that would create. The flood story informs Gilgamesh that there's no secret to immortality. Life is something individuals should appreciate. The human race recreates itself to remain immortal, but the individual must die. The story starts off in Sumeria, where modern-day Iraq exists. The city of Uruk was between the mighty rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The gods are considered forces not to be reckoned with. Upsetting them upsets nature. Within the poem are parables used to give warnings to future generations. There's a cedar story used to describe the repercussions of climate change from 5,000 years ago. It teaches us that cutting down the cedar forest would cause a drought for 7 years. The flood story teaches us that growing the population too quickly would anger the gods and cause them to wash away humankind. This would also endanger the resources required for life. Another story consists of a snake that steals his immortality, sending him to a world that will see his death. This resonates with the snake causing the end of the Garden of Eden. Paradise Lost seems to be influenced by this story. Hercules also had struggles with snakes. First when he was a baby in a crib, and later on in life fighting the Hydra. The snake is feared in many stories, and well earned if you ask me. Creepy little things. Let's get into the whole tale, shall we? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Author unknown. Gilgamesh was the King of Uruk, who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. He was a fierce protector of his city. His buildings were greatly admired. The walls were incredibly strong, providing safety from outside invaders. He was physically beautiful, incredibly strong, and very wise. He had no equal. He was, however, considered a cruel king, as he took what he wanted, including his soldiers' wives. Gilgamesh enforced the Lord's right, having sex with virgin brides on their wedding nights. He forced labor upon his subjects as they groaned under his rule. He was a tyrant. The gods, hearing the pleas of the people of Uruk, decided to create a wild man named Enkidu, who was as magnificent as Gilgamesh, and equal in every way. Enkidu and Gilgamesh became great friends and lovers, until Enkidu died of an illness inflicted by the gods, shattering Gilgamesh's heart. Gilgamesh then traveled the world in search of immortality and the meaning of life. The journey of Gilgamesh is incredibly similar to the legend of Siddhartha. The epic poem starts with the birth of Enkidu, a man born from clay and living in the steppes or grassy plains as a wildling. He lives among the animals. A hunter discovers him. Recognizing his wildness, the hunter sends a temple prostitute named Shamhat to tame him. Women and sex were considered calming forces that would domesticate wild men. Over the next 6 days and 7 nights, the courtesan teaches him everything he needs to know to become a man. After sleeping with the woman, Enkidu no longer has a place in the wild. He's shunned by the animals. He must leave the meadow. The Sumerian word for grassy plains was Eden. The loss of innocence and leaving home is a recurring theme in many traditional tales. The importance of this concept deserves a few quick notes. Families living in small gatherings of people would have been aware of the necessity of safe breeding practices. To ensure the survival of our species, sons and daughters had to move to other social societies, often at a young age. Many societies have oral traditions about leaving our families as we come of age. The tales focus around the loss of innocence and leaving the safety of our homes, our gardens of Eden, as we transition from adolescence into adulthood. The familiar stories were meant to comfort the fear of children. Oral histories were common in ancient societies. They usually dealt with leaving the sanctity of home and not being able to return. This ensured safe breeding for farmers and smaller tribes. Mermaid mythologies often explore the theme of never being able to return home once you leave. Learning about the atrocities of Gilgamesh on his own people, Enkidu sets off to Uruk with the mission to challenge him. Upon his arrival, he catches Gilgamesh forcing his way into a bride's wedding chamber. Enkidu blocks the passageway, and the two godlike men fight fiercely in an epic battle. Gilgamesh finally prevails, but is in awe of the only man who has ever had the strength to fight him. With much respect for each other, the two become inseparable friends and lovers. They decide to go on an adventure together in search of fame. Gilgamesh and Enkidu travel to a distant cedar forest forbidden to mortals. There they decide to steal trees from the forest, knowing that they will upset the terrifying demon Humbaba, the devoted servant of Enlil, the god of earth, wind, and air. Humbaba is awakened by the sounds of the adventurers cutting down the sacred trees. Angrily, Humbaba confronts the two men. But standing side by side, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight the monster. They're able to kill the demon with the help of Shamash, the sun god. Afterwards, they cut down the sacred trees, making an enormous gate and using the rest to make a raft that they sail back to Uruk. The gods become angry at Gilgamesh for killing their watchful demon. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu only think of themselves and their glory. Upon their return to Uruk, Ishtar, the goddess of sex and violence, is overcome with lust for Gilgamesh. Her past lovers have met excruciating pain, so Gilgamesh wisely spurns her. Enraged, Ishtar begs her father, Anu, the god of the sky, to send the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh. The bull is sent down, bringing 7 years of famine to Uruk. It's interesting that in this story, destroying all the sacred trees brings about famine. It seems like people throughout millennia have been aware of climate change and overconsumption of resources. Anyways, back to our story. Gilgamesh and Enkidu wrestle the bull and kill it by cutting off one of its legs and beating it to death. The bull is thrown back up to heaven, where it resides as a series of stars known as the constellation Taurus. Angered, the gods meet in council and decide that the two friends must be punished for their actions. They sentence Enkidu to death. Shortly after, Enkidu falls ill. Through his immense suffering, he shares his visions of the underworld with Gilgamesh. When he finally dies, Gilgamesh is distraught. For the first time, Gilgamesh must accept the prospect of his own death. He cannot stop grieving for Enkidu. Throwing off his kingly attire, he puts on the skin of a lion as a way to honor Enkidu. He sets off into the wilderness, determined to find the one person who has escaped death and found immortality. Utnapishtim is the Mesopotamian Noah who survived the Great Flood after a god told them to build a ship that would carry him, his family, and their animals away. The gods wanted to teach the humans a lesson for abusing the planet. But one god felt sorry for the humans and warned Utnapishtim about the flood that was supposed to wash away all humankind. After surviving the flood, Utnapishtim is granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh decides he must find Utnapishtim and learn the secret to eternal life, avoiding the death that claimed Enkidu. His journey takes him to the twin-peaked mountain called Mashu, where the sun sets behind one peak and rises from the other. Utnapishtim lives beyond the mountain, which is guarded by 2 scorpion monsters. The scorpions refuse to allow Gilgamesh to enter the tunnel that passes through the mountains. Gilgamesh pleads with them until they finally grant him passage. The tunnel is pitch black, testing his courage, but he emerges into a beautiful garden overlooking the sea. There, he meets Sijuri, a tavern keeper. He describes his quest for immortality. She warns him about such a quest and tells him to be satisfied with the pleasures of this world. But he's determined. She sends him to Urshanabi, the ferryman. On the boat, they journey across the sea through the waters of death. On the other side, they meet Utnapishtim. He relates how the gods met in council and decided to wash away humankind forever. The god of wisdom warned Utnapishtim about the plans and gave him the idea to build the gigantic ship which would save his family and the seeds of every living thing. After they escaped the flood and the waters receded, the gods regretted what they had done. They decided not to destroy humankind again and granted Utnapishtim eternal life. People would continue to die, but humankind would survive. Gilgamesh insists that he should be allowed to live forever. So Utnapishtim gives him a test. He says, if you can stay awake for 7 days, you can live for eternity. But after his long voyage, Gilgamesh fails the challenge. He's unable to stay awake. Utnapishtim orders him to return to his people. But just as Gilgamesh is set to leave, Utnapishtim's wife tells him about a miraculous plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the ocean to find the plant. He brings it back to land, but when he's drying off, a snake steals it from him. Slithering away, the snake sheds its skin, becoming young again. The snake stealing the youth and sending Gilgamesh from the garden sounds like a familiar tale. Starting from a beautiful garden that leads to the holder of eternal life, Gilgamesh meets the Mesopotamian Noah. Utnapishtim offers up the plant, that restores youth. When Gilgamesh takes it, he's tricked by a snake and sent back to his city knowing he will live a life that feels pain, suffering, and ends in death. Certainly sounds like a familiar creation story. Adam and Eve seems to incorporate traces of these events. In fact, some scholars consider the birth of Enkidu to be the origin story for Adam and Eve. Enkidu was created by a god being born from soil into a setting surrounded by nature and animals. He's introduced to a woman who was created from a pinch of clay. She seduces him, offers him food and clothing. When he accepts, he's forced to leave his realm, unable to return. The snake, later on stealing the plant of immortality, is another theme that seems to have been borrowed. Empty-handed, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and accepts his mortality. He understands that he can't live forever, but that humankind can carry on. He sees the beauty of the city he created and accepts that his achievements in this life will be the closest he will come to immortality. This is a tale of what it means to be human. This is not a religious mythology. The first story ever recorded deals with our fascination and fear of death and our desire to overcome it. This still resonates today. This story was created and evolved before the ancient Greeks, before Buddhism and Christianity. The story of an epic hero searching for the meaning of life. The very first recorded story had the elements that we still use today, almost like storytelling is being imprinted into our DNA. Did we master storytelling with our very first attempt? Have we been recycling the same story elements right up to the current Hollywood Marvel movies? Is the meaning of life the most compelling story we have? Is that a common thought that we all share? A search for purpose? A desire to be an individual in a life of commonality? I don't know. But I know I'm going to keep searching, keep adventuring, find new places and experiences that are unique to me. Even if there's not a single plot of land anywhere left on this earth that hasn't already been traced by the outline of another human's footprint, I'm still going to search. Because in my lifetime, I want to battle Humbaba. I want to find Utnapishtim and find the fountain of youth. I can't help but feel Gilgamesh would have been gutted to learn his epic tale was nearly lost forever and disappeared for thousands of years. But then I imagine how happy he would be to know that the stories were to be rediscovered by archaeologists 150 years ago. I like to think he's smiling right now as he listens to his life story being told to new generations through the ancient art of storytelling. Interestingly, the Epic of Gilgamesh Dream Tablet was looted from an Iraqi museum in 1991. It was stolen sometime during the Gulf War. The small clay tablet measures 5 by 6 inches. It dates back 3,500 years. Named the Dream Tablet because it contains a segment in which Gilgamesh recounts his dreams to his mother. She lets him know that the person he dreams of will become his friend and companion. This is where Gilgamesh describes dreaming of Enkidu. The poem was deciphered by George Smith, who was the first person to read the Epic of Gilgamesh in 2,500 years. One of the oldest surviving works of literature, one of the oldest surviving religious texts. Found in 1853. It's part of a 12-tablet collection, discovered in the rubble of a library of an Assyrian king. Sometime during the Gulf War, the tablet disappeared from an Iraqi museum. The tablet was sold in London for just over $50,000 in 2003. It was shipped and labeled as ceramic tiles. A dealer smuggled the tablet into the United States, where it reportedly changed hands several times. In 2014, It was sold at Christie's auction house in London to Hobby Lobby, an arts and crafts store. It sold for $1.67 million. It was put on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington. Homeland Security seized the tablet from the museum in 2019. After 30 years of being smuggled through many countries with false documents, it was returned to its homeland, once again, in September of 2021. It now resides in the National Museum of Baghdad. Hobby Lobby has been forced to return over 11,000 artifacts to Egypt and Iraq. They were ordered to pay a $3 million fine. It's one of 17,000 stolen artifacts that have been repatriated to Iraq. They've been recovered from America, Britain, Italy, Japan, and the Netherlands. It was finally returned after a 30-year odyssey.